At 13 years old, she walked onto the biggest stage in television. Shaking, barely speaking, wearing long sleeves to hide how small she felt inside. Then the music started. Within seconds, 3,000 people were on their feet. Simon Cowell, a man who has heard every voice on the planet, sat back with his jaw open. The world called it a miracle. But nobody asked what happened after the cameras turned off. That question, that answer, broke even Simon Cowell. Heselden is a small village in County Durham, England. It is the kind of place where everyone knows your name, where the streets are quiet by 8 o'clock, and where extraordinary things are not supposed to happen. Courtney Hadwin grew up there. And for most of her childhood, the world had absolutely no idea she existed. That was the way she preferred it. From the time she could understand social situations, Courtney found them unbearable. Not difficult. Not awkward. Unbearable. She wasn't a child who needed encouragement to open up. She was a child whose nervous system treated a crowded classroom the way most people treat a burning building. In a full year of school, she would speak fewer than 100 words to anyone outside her immediate family. Not 100 sentences. 100 words. She counted the exits in every room. She knew which closets at school were empty. She used them. Her teachers noticed the silence. But silence in a quiet child is easy to overlook. There were no outbursts, no failing grades severe enough to trigger alarm. Just a girl who wasn't quite there, even when she was standing right in front of you. What nobody saw, what the closets and the hallways and the quiet lunch tables never revealed, was what happened when she was alone. Alone, Courtney Hadwin sang. She sang like the room was full. She sang like Tina Turner was watching from the back row. She taught herself the runs, the growls, the raw-throated ache of Janis Joplin by listening to records and then trying, again and again, to make her body produce the same impossible sounds. She was 9 years old when she first watched a girl her own age perform on Britain's Got Talent and felt something click. Not a dream, exactly. More like a recognition. That is what I am supposed to be doing. But singing in a bedroom and singing for the world are separated by something most people never cross. Then, in September 2015, someone left a camera running at lunchtime. Courtney was performing at an open mic session at the Academy at Shotton Hall. Not a concert, not a competition, just a school lunch event that most students were half ignoring. She stepped up and sang "Say Something" by Great Big World and Christina Aguilera. It wasn't planned as a moment. Nobody briefed a camera crew. A phone went up, the video spread, and suddenly the girl who barely spoke 100 words a year was being watched by strangers across the country. She had no idea what that meant yet. Within 2 years, she would be standing on the stage of The Voice Kids UK, reaching the top 6. The machine had found her. And the machine, once it finds you, does not ask whether you are ready. Before we go any further, do you think talent shows should be allowed to put teenagers in the spotlight this young? Drop your answer in the comments. By the end of this video, that question will mean something very different to you. She had already survived The Voice Kids. But America's Got Talent was a different species entirely. In the spring of 2018, a 15-year-old girl from County Durham walked into the audition room for AGT Season 13 and tried to disappear into herself. The cameras were everywhere. The audience was enormous. The judges, 4 of them, including Simon Cowell, a man whose professional expression has terrified contestants for 2 decades, sat behind their table with the quiet authority of people who have seen everything. Courtney answered their questions in a voice so small the microphone barely caught it. She told them she liked old music. She mentioned Janis Joplin. Howie Mandel smiled politely. The audience waited with the specific kind of patience people reserve for someone they expect to fail gently. Then the first chord of Otis Redding's "Hard to Handle" hit the speakers. What happened next was not a performance. It was a possession. The shy, barely audible girl who had just been standing there vanished, and in her place was something feral and electric and completely uncontainable. Her hips moved. Her arms shot out. Her voice, that voice, tore through the auditorium like a current, and 3,000 people were on their feet before the first verse was done. The judges' faces changed in real time. Mel B's hands went to her mouth. Heidi Klum was standing. Howie Mandel looked like a man who had just remembered why he loved music in the first place. Simon Cowell said, quietly, almost to himself, "You are like a lion." Howie Mandel didn't wait for the song to end. He hit the golden buzzer. Gold confetti rained from the ceiling. The audience roared. And Courtney Hadwin, the girl who used to hide in school closets, stood at the center of it all, hands pressed to her face, trying to process what had just happened to her life. The audition video hit 50 million views in 5 months. By the time she performed again on the first live broadcast, the host announced the number had crossed 200 million. 200 million people watching a 15-year-old girl from a village most of them couldn't find on a map. Here is what those 200 million people did not see. Backstage, after the confetti fell and the cameras stopped rolling, Courtney was fighting to breathe. The anxiety that had followed her through every school corridor, every lunch table, every room she had ever wanted to escape, it did not take the night off for her big moment. It showed up. It always showed up. The performance was real. The transformation was real. But the girl underneath it, the one still counting exits, still cataloging the distance between herself and the nearest door, she was real too. Fame does not cure anxiety. It amplifies everything. And what was about to be amplified in Courtney Hadwin's life was something the audience, cheering from their living rooms, couldn't have predicted. She went all the way to the finals. She performed Tina Turner, James Brown, Steppenwolf. She got standing ovations every single time. And then, in the finale, she finished 6th. 6. The girl with 200 million views. 6. Simon Cowell's jaw tightened when the result was read. He had seen talent before. But he hadn't seen anything quite like this. He wasn't done with her yet. A 6th-place finish on the biggest talent show on American television would end most people's stories. It didn't end Courtney's. It just changed the shape of what was coming. In December 2018, the announcement came. Arista Records, one of the most storied labels in music history, had signed Courtney Hadwin to a multi-disc deal. The partnership was made alongside Simon Cowell's own Psycho Music, the label responsible for launching One Direction, Susan Boyle, and a roster of names that had redefined what a talent show could produce. Tyler Brown, Psycho's managing director, put it plainly, Courtney is a force of nature. When she hits the stage, there is no one like her in the world. Arista's president, David Massey, called her an exceptional talent with a voice and spirit well beyond her years. Simon himself said, Courtney is an amazing artist. I will never forget her first audition. She was 14 years old. She had a deal with 2 of the most powerful music entities on the planet. She had Simon Cowell in her corner. She was supposed to be untouchable. She was not untouchable. What began almost immediately, quietly, without fanfare, without a single press release, was a process of erosion. Courtney Hadwin had earned her audience by sounding like no one else. Raw, gritty, rooted in rock and soul and the kind of ferocity that had not existed in a teenager's body since the 1970s. That was the voice that had stopped a room. That was the voice that had broken 200 million views. The label wanted something softer. Something more radio-friendly. Something that could be packaged and sold to a broader demographic without the rough edges getting in the way. She was being sanded down. In October 2019, her debut EP, The Cover Sessions, arrived. 4 tracks. Covers of songs chosen not by Courtney, but shaped by committee. Old Town Road. Sucker. Songs that had nothing to do with the fire that had made her famous. She performed them. She smiled in the press photos. And privately, she understood that the people who owned her career and the person who had built it were not the same people. Then 2020 arrived. And the industry did something to Courtney Hadwin that no amount of anxiety or stage fright had ever managed to do. It discarded her without looking her in the eye. Psycho Music shut down. The label, Simon Cowell's label, the one that had promised her the world, ceased operations. This was news. It was reported in the music press, discussed in industry circles, written up on websites that track label closures the way weather services track storms. Courtney found out the same way everyone else did. She read it in the news. No phone call. No meeting. No conversation. Her career, the one she had given her teenage years to, the one she had reshuffled her entire psychological landscape to survive, was gone. And the people responsible for telling her couldn't be bothered to make a call. The man who had called her a lion had built a cage around her potential, and then the cage simply disappeared, leaving her standing in a field she didn't recognize, with no map and no signal. If this story is hitting differently than you expected, that's exactly the point. Subscribe right now, because the next chapter is the one nobody talks about. It is the darkest part of Courtney Hadwin's story, and it almost ended everything. After the label collapsed, the phone stopped ringing. That is the part no one documents. Not the dramatic collapse, not the public statement, the silence that follows. The weeks where you check your email and there is nothing. The weeks where your name, once attached to 200 million views, produces no calls, no offers, no plan. Just silence. The agoraphobia began slowly. It tends to. First, going outside felt harder than usual. Then it felt dangerous. Then, at a certain point, the space between the front door and the pavement became as terrifying as any stage she had ever stood on. For 3 months, she could not leave her house. Not the corner shop. Not the street outside. Nothing. The girl who had performed for thousands, who had stood beneath golden confetti and heard the roar of a stadium, she was now afraid of her own front garden. This is what the fan forums didn't know. They posted theories. They refreshed her social media. They asked each other where she had gone, and the answers they invented were far kinder than the truth. The label that had absorbed her account after Psycho's closure was not in contact. There was no management infrastructure reaching out to check on a teenager in County Durham who had gone silent. The industry had moved on. It always moves on. Youth and virality have a shelf life, and once that clock expires, the phone stops ringing regardless of how good the voice is. Courtney Hadwin was a global name with no support system. She was alone in the most complete sense of the word. Not physically, her family was there, but professionally, creatively, structurally. There was no one steering the ship because the ship had been quietly decommissioned while she was looking the other way. And yet, somehow, in the depth of that silence, something was forming. She started writing. Not covers, not label-approved tracks. Her own words, her own pain, her own specific vocabulary for what the past 2 years had felt like. A song called Monsters began to take shape. It wasn't polished. It wasn't radio-ready. It was honest in the way that only someone with nothing left to lose can be honest. But before she could release it, before she could release anything, something happened to her voice. Here's the thing. A lot of us know what it feels like to pour everything into something, and then have it taken away by someone else's decision. Not a mistake you made. Not a failure. Someone else's boardroom call, someone else's budget cut, someone else's phone that never rang. Courtney's story is not just a celebrity story. It's a human one. If you've ever been that person, this next part is for you. In early 2025, Courtney Hadwin lost her voice. Not metaphorically. Not the slow erosion of confidence that had been eating at her for years. A vocal hemorrhage, a rupture of the blood vessels in her vocal cords, that required immediate medical intervention and months of enforced, total silence. No singing. No performing. In some cases, depending on severity, barely any speaking. For most people, this would be a serious medical event. For a singer, for this singer, the one whose entire identity had been built around the sound her body could produce, it was something closer to an existential crisis. The rumors started almost immediately. Social media, deprived of facts, manufactures them. Within days, posts were circulating claiming Courtney Hadwin had been in a severe car accident. Then the posts got worse. People began speaking about her in past tense. Fan pages posted tribute graphics. Comment sections filled with grief. Thousands of people who had watched that AGT audition video, who had felt something real in those 3 minutes of a teenage girl setting herself on fire with music, were mourning someone who was still alive. Courtney sat in silence and read every word. She could not respond. Not with her voice. Not with the instrument that had defined her since she was 9 years old, standing in front of a school lunch crowd in Peterlee and deciding, for the first time, to let people hear what lived inside her. She could only wait. The waiting is a particular kind of torture for creative people. The inability to make something, to process the world through the one language that has always made sense, produces a specific, grinding pain that sits somewhere between grief and frustration and pure, helpless stillness. She used that time. She thought about what she wanted her music to say, now that she finally had the right to say it herself. She thought about the label, about the phone that never rang, about the version of herself that had been slowly, politely redirected away from everything that made her real. Then, one morning, months after the hemorrhage, after the silence, after reading her own eulogies online, she stood in a room, opened her mouth, and sang the first note. Nobody filmed it. Nobody was there to post it online. There was no confetti, no golden buzzer, no Simon Cowell watching from a leather chair. But in February 2023, before the hemorrhage, in the first act of her independence, she had already drawn the line. She released Breakable, her first fully original, fully independent single. When a fan commented and mentioned Simon's name, she replied directly, "It's all me for this one. Completely independent. Finally doing it my way." 8 words. The weight of 5 years inside them. In 2025, Courtney Hadwin released her debut album. Not a cover EP assembled by committee. Not a label showcase designed to test market appeal. A full album, 12 tracks of original music, written in the years the world wasn't watching, produced on her own.